Hello and welcome. Tonight, we begin something slow, something quiet, something long, but not long in the dramatic sense, not epic tales of conquest or the pounding hooves of cavalry charging into destiny. No, tonight is a different kind of long, a kind of long that stretches across generations. No one quite knew how to stop them, or even why they had started. The day behind you, and the stillness of evening settling in. Let the warmth of the covers wrap around you as we explore these strangely sleepy corners of the past. Wars that took lifetimes to resolve, if they were resolved at all. Wars that sometimes forgot they were wars. It begins with confusion, continues with delays, and ends with a shrug. Tonight, we're entering the world of boring wars. And about a pig? Yes, one pig. Conflicts that dragged on not because of fierce resistance or military brilliance, but because, if you're listening now, perhaps you're already lying back, eyes growing heavier. You'll hear about treaties that solved nothing, about armies that marched and then unmarched, about battles that lasted minutes but gave their names to decades. But don't worry, none of it will come too quickly. Everything tonight will arrive slowly, gently, softly, like the turning of pages in an old, dusty book, but mostly delivered long pauses, aching winters, and forgotten campaigns. Let us begin where many wars begin, between France and England, and with a name that sounds impressive. Imagine being born during a war, and then growing up, living your full life and dying. And the war still hasn't ended. Now imagine the same thing, happening again and again and again. This was the experience of many who lived between 1337 and 1453. During what we now call the 100 Years' War, it wasn't one war, really. It's not in the way we think of war today. It was more like a series of unfortunate interruptions. A feud that forgot how to end, split into episodes, pauses, delays, and occasional bursts of drama. At its core was a dispute over who should wear the crown of France. The English king's descendants of French nobility believed they had a right to rule. The French kings disagreed. No one could agree on how inheritance worked across borders. And so, over the next 116 years, both sides did what kings and nobles did best. They wrote letters, summoned armies, canceled attacks because it rained, and negotiated treaties they didn't intend to keep. The war's early days saw flashes of action. He just wants his crops to grow and for no one to burn them this year. There were battles at Poitiers and Agnicourt, and we'll return to those in a moment. But much of the time, there were just years. Quiet, confusing years. Imagine a French farmer in 1372. He doesn't care who sits on the throne. Or a village blacksmith who hears a rumor that the English are coming. Then nothing happens for 6 more years. Or it would have if medieval peasants had headlines. Taken back to London, held for ransom. The French crown practically fell into English hands. England hesitated. Entire generations lived in this fog of tension, the kind of tension that keeps people poor and afraid, but rarely reaches a conclusion. For long stretches, there were truces, treaties, armies that gathered and then dispersed without fighting. Now and then, something did happen. Use clever tactics and mud to destroy a superior French force. In 1346, the Battle of where English longbowmen decimated French cavalry made headlines. In 1356, King John II of France was captured at Poitiers, but instead of capitalizing on the moment, and France, despite the blow, continued. Then came Agincourt in 1415, a teenage girl from a small village who believed she was chosen by God to drive the English out of France. She lifted the siege of and inspired a weary nation. Territories changed hands so many times that some towns didn't even know which country they belonged to anymore. A glorious English victory immortalized by Shakespeare centuries later. The English, sick, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered, the King Henry V became a legend. But again, it was one battle. After the glory came more waiting. One of the most famous figures of the war, Joan of Arc, appeared in the late 1420s, but just 2 years later she was captured and burned at the stake as the war continued. By the time it ended in 1453, nearly every player from the early chapters was long gone. Kings had died, generals forgotten. And turn our attention to a smaller conflict, one that began not with claims of crowns, but with the theft of a wooden bucket. The war didn't end with a dramatic final battle. It ended with exhaustion. England had grown weary. France had reclaimed its land, and the people. They had already moved on mentally years earlier. What remained were ruined villages, crippled economies, and a new French identity slowly solidifying. And so the 100 Years' War passed into history, not with a bang, but with a long drawn-out sigh. It teaches us something important, that history isn't always about action. Sometimes it's about waiting, hoping, enduring. And with that, we leave France and England to rebuild. Let's now drift southward. Down through the Alps, where the air becomes warmer, the land begins to fragment into city-states, and the politics grow. Theatrical. Welcome to Italy, not the unified nation we know today, but a quilt of proud, independent republics and duchies, each with its own ambitions, armies, and history of holding grudges. It's the year 1325, and our story takes place between two such cities, Modena and Bologna. Now, these weren't global superpowers. They didn't command empires or build fleets that sailed to the ends of the earth. But within their own patch of northern Italy, they carried themselves with enormous pride. They were caught in a larger ideological tug-of-war between two medieval factions. The Guelphs, loyal to the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor. And like many of their neighbors, every city leaned one way or the other. And every local skirmish could be interpreted as part of a grand, sacred struggle, even if it began with something as mundane as livestock theft or, yes, a bucket. This wasn't just politics. It was identity. The War of the Oaken Bucket began, as so many absurd stories do, with a small act of provocation. A group of soldiers from Modena reportedly raided a well in Bologna and took a bucket. Just a bucket. To have a bucket stolen from within its walls was indeed just an insult. It was a symbolic slap in the face. Perhaps, and this is the theory favored by modern historians, they did it simply to humiliate their rivals. Wooden, plain, no gold trim, no sacred relic inside. Just a container for water. Why they took it is unclear. Perhaps they were thirsty. Perhaps they were drunk. Now, Bologna was a proud city, home to Europe's oldest university, a center of law, language, and prestige. Bologna demanded it back. Modena refused. And suddenly, a minor insult escalated into a full-blown military campaign. Raised an army of over 30,000 men, a staggering number for a city-state, especially for a conflict sparked by stolen plumbing equipment. Modena, smaller and scrappier, gathered around 7,000 soldiers, including knights, crossbowmen, and local volunteers. They met outside the small village of Zappolino, on a field now mostly forgotten by history. The battle itself was short. There was no prolonged siege, no cunning military maneuver, No dramatic turning point. The bucket was just the final spark in a pile of slow-burning grievances. Modena simply fought harder and faster. And imagine both calling the police, their lawyers, and a small army. Their troops overwhelmed the larger Bolognese force, forcing them to retreat in disarray. Honor mattered. Pride mattered. Sometimes escalation was easier than apology. The war was over. The bucket remained in Modena, still proudly displayed today in the Tor della Ghirlandina, the city's bell tower, placed like a war trophy, encased in a shrine, as if it were a crown jewel. But of course, the bucket wasn't really the point. What mattered was the rivalry. Modena and Bologna had clashed for generations, over borders, politics, ideology. To understand the absurdity of it, imagine two neighbors, longtime enemies, coming to blows because one borrowed a garden hose without asking. The farmers returned to their fields. The scholars returned to their scrolls. The bucket sat in its new home. And yet this wasn't entirely unique. In medieval Italy, wars between cities were often driven by insults, family feuds, or minor land disputes. But what makes the War of the Oaken Bucket so memorable is precisely its pettiness. How a simple, object-based conflict echoed centuries of rivalry and bloodshed. It also illustrates the ritualistic nature of medieval war. Both cities felt compelled to act out their anger in full performative fashion, with banners, proclamations, and armed conflict. But when the dust settled, nothing had changed. No borders shifted. But if two cities, locked in a centuries-old game of you started it, marching out to battle with full ceremony, over a bucket, no dynasties fell. Just a bucket. Now with legendary status, beautifully boring. There's something oddly comforting about that. In a time when wars often led to famine, plagues, and long-term occupation, the War of the Oaken Bucket was over quickly and life resumed. Perhaps that's why the war stayed in public memory. It was short, it was strange, and it made people smile. Even centuries later, in 17th century literature, the war was even turned into a macapic poem by poet Alessandro Tassini, titled La Secchia Rapita, The Stolen Bucket. He portrayed the event as a parody of grand epics like the Iliad, turning petty civic rivalry into Homeric legend. Knights died for the bucket. Gods quarreled over it. Cities wept for its loss. All in jest, but based on real events. And so, as you lie back and imagine this war, think not of cannon fire or endless sieges, a war with almost no cost. No change, but just enough drama to make it unforgettable. And in its own way, let's now turn to a different kind of war, one that crossed oceans, spanned continents, and resulted in 0 human casualties. Its most famous casualty? A pig. Now we cross oceans and centuries, moving from the medieval hills of Italy to the forested, rain-swept islands of the Pacific Northwest. The year is 1859. Steamships roam the coastline. The telegraph is speeding up communication. And yet, diplomacy, like war, still moves at the speed of human stubbornness. Our story begins with a map. And like many diplomatic problems, it begins with a badly written treaty. Back in 1846, the Oregon Treaty was signed between the United States and Great Britain, dividing their respective territories in the Pacific Northwest. The goal was to avoid conflict over a region both had explored and settled. And for the most part, it worked. The treaty stated that the boundary would follow the 49th parallel. But when it reached the coast, it would continue through the middle of the channel, which separates the continent from Vancouver Island. It seemed clear enough, till someone looked at the map more closely. There were 2 channels, not one. And in between them, a small cluster of islands. Among them, the San Juan Islands. Both countries claimed them. Both sent settlers. It was sparsely populated, mostly by American settlers and a few British employees of the Hudson's Bay Company, who raised sheep under contract with the Crown. Both avoided direct conflict for a while. The island's landscape was peaceful, with tall evergreens, rocky shorelines, and fertile patches of farmland. There were no fences, no posted flags, just quiet occupation. It had a habit of wandering into the nearby farm of Lyman Cutler, an American settler from Kentucky. For years, the two groups coexisted uneasily, each pretending not to notice the other. And then, one day in June of 1859, a pig crossed the line, or what might have been the line. The pig belonged to Charles Griffin, an Irishman working for the Hudson's Bay Company. It wasn't the first time. The pig had a particular fondness for potatoes. Cutler had tolerated it at first. He warned Griffin. Griffin allegedly replied, "It's your responsibility to fence your crops." So, on that quiet summer morning, Lyman Cutler did something drastic. He shot the pig. The act was neither strategic nor symbolic. It was just frustration. But the reaction was almost comical in scale. Griffin was furious. He demanded compensation. $100, which was no small sum at the time. Cutler refused. Griffin reported the incident to British authorities. Suddenly, what had been a minor nuisance became an international incident. American settlers, fearing arrest by the British, appealed to the U.S. Army. Within weeks, Captain George Pickett, yes, that Pickett, who would later become famous at Gettysburg, arrived on San Juan Island with 60 men from the 9th Infantry. The Americans expanded their force to over 400 troops, building defensive positions, digging in. His orders: defend American citizens. His attitude: aggressive. The British response came by sea. 3 Royal Navy warships arrived under the command of Captain Geoffrey Hornby. Anchoring off the coast, their cannons aimed inland. At one point, the British had over 2,000 naval personnel positioned nearby. Both sides waited and waited. It's worth pausing to imagine the absurdity of the scene. Soldiers building camps, cooking rations, drilling formations, all while knowing that the only casualty of this war was a pig that liked potatoes. No one wanted to be the one who escalated things further. No one wanted history to remember them as the officer who started a war over livestock. And so the standoff dragged on. They held joint holiday celebrations, played cricket, traded goods, attended each other's funerals. Some even became friends. For weeks and then months. U.S. President James Buchanan, already dealing with domestic tensions that would soon lead to the Civil War, didn't want another problem. British authorities in Canada, likewise, were reluctant to act without clear orders from London. Eventually, a peaceful agreement was reached. Both nations agreed to joint military occupation of the island, while the matter was settled diplomatically. For the next 12 years, a few dozen American and British soldiers lived side by side on the island. In 1871, as part of the broader Treaty of Washington, both countries agreed to submit the San Juan boundary dispute to international arbitration. The chosen arbitrator, Kaiser Wilhelm, the First of Germany. In 1872, after months of review, the German Commission ruled in favor of the United States. The British withdrew peacefully. The matter was closed. The pig, of course, had long since disappeared. But the site of the incident is now a historic park. A simple wooden sign reads, "This marks the location of the pig war." It's one of history's gentlest border disputes. No shots fired, no lives lost, save one. A pig whose only crime was being hungry. And in that quiet standoff, we find something oddly reassuring. That even in an age of empire, conflict could be paused, for the sake of common sense. And so we drift forward, leaving behind this strange moment in frontier diplomacy and moving now to a different kind of war. A colder one. Not over pigs or buckets, but over fear itself. Imagine a war where the most dangerous weapon is the idea of war itself. No bayonets clashing, no cities stormed, just glances, speeches, silence so thick it echoed through decades. This was the Cold War. It began, not with an invasion, but with a victory. World War II had ended. The world was in ruins. Cities lay in rubble. Nations wept. And out of that destruction, two powers emerged from opposite sides of the globe, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both had won the war, but they had very different visions of what came next. And so, like housemates who share a kitchen but can't agree on what to cook, they began watching each other, closely, silently, suspiciously. From the late 1940s until the early 1990s, the world lived under the weight of this strange, invisible conflict. There was no official start date, just a gradual chill. In 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill described an iron curtain falling across Europe, a metaphor that quickly became real. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence. Western Europe aligned with the US and its allies. Germany, the heart of the last war, was split in two, and thus the world map itself became a battlefield. But instead of soldiers, there were diplomats. Instead of bombs, there were documents. And instead of flags waving on hillsides, there were red pins and blue pins stuck into the soft cork of strategy rooms. What made the Cold War feel so heavy was not what happened, but what might happen. Both sides developed nuclear weapons, bombs powerful enough to end civilization in minutes. This created a concept both horrifying and strangely reassuring: mutually assured destruction. Or a MAD, if either side launched an attack, the other would respond with equal force, and both would be obliterated. So neither side moved. Instead, they listened. Spies traded secrets in alleyways. Surveillance planes flew over icy mountains. Tire agencies, the CIA, the KGB, were born to watch, to whisper, to wonder. Satellites hovered overhead, not to drop bombs, but to take photographs. Photographs of airfields, of silos, of shadows. The world became a chessboard, but no one wanted to take the first piece. But while generals plotted in secret, ordinary life continued. Children in America practiced hiding under desks, duck and cover drills in case of nuclear attack. In the Soviet Union, posters promised progress, unity, and strength. Television carried speeches from leaders promising peace, while building weapons. In many ways, the Cold War seeped into the fabric of daily life. It was there in cartoons, in books, in whispered conversations. In movie theaters, villains had accents. In classrooms, maps were color-coded. Blue for us, red for them. And through it all, most people just went to work, paid bills, fed their children, and hoped the news never said launch. The Cold War never stayed in one place. It flared up in Korea, in Vietnam, in Cuba, in Afghanistan, like sparks in dry grass. But even then, the two superpowers rarely fought each other directly. Instead, they supported opposite sides. Proxy wars, they were called, and in them, soldiers bled, but not the ones making decisions. One of the most frightening moments came in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, the world held its breath as American ships surrounded the island of Cuba, where Soviet missiles had been installed. For 13 days, humanity hovered inches from annihilation. And then, talks, compromise, silence. The missiles were removed. The world exhaled. In contrast to the fear, there was fascination. Out of the Cold War came one of humanity's proudest achievements: space exploration. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It's just a small beeping orb, but it changed everything. The US responded with NASA, and soon the race to the moon had begun. It was a war of rockets instead of rifles. Not as Americans or Soviets, but as people amazed. of engineers instead of soldiers. And in 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, millions watched. It was perhaps the Cold War's only moment of unity. As decades passed, the Cold War became less dramatic, but no less present. Walls were built, most famously the Berlin Wall, dividing East and West Berlin. It's built overnight, brutal, stark, and for 28 years it stood as a symbol of the divide. But even walls crumble. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union weakened, economies strained, public trust eroded, and in 1989, something remarkable happened. The Berlin Wall came down, crowds gathered, hammers chipped away. East met West, not with violence, but with tears and cheers. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. Quietly. No last battle, just a new name, a new map. And so, the Cold War, this long, anxious whisper of history, faded into memory. What made the Cold War so unique and so perfect for a story before sleep is how much of it was shaped by inaction. What didn't happen is what defined it. A war that was never declared, but hard to touch. A war that was everywhere and nowhere, or that, like a dream, was real. And yet its shadow shaped the 20th century. We ease into the final chapter of our journey, a soft reflection on the wars we've visited and the peculiar beauty in their quiet persistence. Its silence built the modern world. Now, as we step gently away from this long, slow conflict, we ease into the final chapter of our journey, a soft reflection on the wars we've visited and the peculiar beauty in their quiet persistence. And now we reach the end, but not with a grand finale, not with a climactic charge nor a roaring speech. A soft return from a journey that moved slowly, steadily, like history itself. We've spent the last 2 hours walking alongside forgotten soldiers, cautious generals, and patient diplomats. We've passed through centuries of slow-burning tension, bureaucratic entanglements, and conflicts so calm they sometimes forgot to be wars at all. What ties these moments together isn't bloodshed or fire, it's persistence, stalemate, in some cases, boredom. But in that stillness is meaning. The 100 Years' War stretching across lifetimes reminded us that wars aren't always fought with swords. Sometimes they're fought with signatures and silence. A conflict so long that it raised and buried generations, and no one truly remembered how it began. The War of the Oaken Bucket, absurd and short, taught us how human pride can inflate the smallest insult into a banner for battle. 2 cities, 2 ideals, and 1 wooden pail. It showed us that what we fight over often matters less than the fact that we always ready to fight. The Pig War, delicate and absurd, demonstrated how restraint can win the day, that sometimes the best way to resolve a crisis is to stop and do nothing. A single pig, a disputed garden, and the quiet realization that war wasn't worth it. And finally, the Cold War, a global theater of suspicion, of philosophies divided by wires and walls, taught us that fear is its own battlefield, that waiting, watching, and not acting can be the most exhausting form of conflict of all. These weren't the wars taught with flashy animations and school documentaries, so they weren't the ones adapted into movies with swelling orchestral scores. They were the slow ones, the whispered ones. The wars of empty fields, paused negotiations, and forgotten footnotes in dusty treaties. But they mattered, because through them we glimpsed the truth of how history works, not always in bursts, not always in victories, but in long pauses, quiet decisions, and people simply enduring. Behind every king who delayed a battle, every soldier who stood on a hill and didn't fire, every diplomat who chose compromise over pride, there was someone trying to hold the world together. And though history often forgets their names, tonight As you lie still and listen to the closing hum of the past, they are here. So as you rest, perhaps already adrift in that soft space between waking and sleep, remember this: the world you know, with its stable borders, its silent skies, and its complex but mostly peaceful nights, was built not just by heroes and revolutions, but by moments of hesitation, by years that dragged on, by papers signed instead of shots fired, by history's most boring wars. The next time you hear the phrase "nothing happened," remember that sometimes that's exactly what the world needs. Sleep now. Let the slow pulse of history fade behind you. Let the tension unwind. There are no armies on the march, no alarms, no cries, just treaties gathering dust and generals who've gone home. The world is quiet, just the way it needs to be. Good night.